Meantime, a top South African diplomat said on Tuesday that U.S. demands on domestic affirmative action policies, that's the BEE stuff I was talking about a little earlier, are complicating efforts to secure a trade deal. Now, the remarks come ahead of the imposition of a 30% tariff on South African exports to the U.S., which will effectively take effect from Friday. South Africa has tried for months to persuade the American president's administration to lower the tariff rate or exempt key industries in order to avoid hundreds of thousands of potential job losses. But South Africa has struggled to make headway, even as other economies like Japan and the European Union have struck deals with the White House. Sandile Swana is a governance expert and a political analyst. Is joining us now live on the program from Muldersdrift in South Africa with a deeper look at exactly what's going on between these two economies. Mr. Swana, thank you for your time this evening. So let's start with a broad strokes here, right? What is the kind of deal that South Africa is looking for in talks with the Americans? We've seen reports of talks of a top tariff rate of 10% and some products being tariff exempt. Do we know anything else beyond that?
No, the details of the products that are going to be affected and the percentages which will be affected has not been disclosed. So some of the information we have are from the industry bodies as opposed to the government. As an example, citrus industry would want perhaps level tariffs on the basis that the season for citrus in the US versus South Africa is totally different. So there's no competition between these two industries. Instead, they are complementary to each other. And the auto industry has got its own complications because the owners of that industry are Europeans. It's not a South African industry. They operate from here. And that brings its own complications. So, but we do not have details of what is it exactly that South Africa is proposing? So we're stuck.
Indeed. So American trade policy right now seems to be in that, to put it bluntly, a bull in a china shop phase at the moment, right? Just trying to steamroll everyone that they're in talks with. So assuming that 30% tariff rate goes into effect next week, does the Trade Ministry have any plan to offer support to sectors that would be hardest hit, like, you know, citrus, which you've spoken about, in the automotive sector?
The automotive sector especially already has got a number of support programs. So I would expect, although it has not been announced, that they would expand those support programs. The citrus does not. South African agriculture does not have those types of programs. So they would be happening for the first time if they were to be kicked in. But what we do know is that there is a concerted effort by the state to actually assist these sectors to locate new markets, and there is a certain degree of previous success in that regard. But obviously the volumes cannot be handled quickly in the short term.
For decades, South Africa positioned itself as a strategic bridge between the Western world and the global South. Its foreign policy emphasized balance, non-alignment, and economic pragmatism. That balance is now under intense strain as U.S. lawmakers openly threaten trade penalties in response to Pretoria's refusal to align fully with Western foreign policy positions. South Africa's stance has not emerged suddenly. Since the end of apartheid, the country has pursued an independent diplomatic identity rooted in sovereignty, multilateralism, and resistance to external coercion. This approach has grown more pronounced as global power structures shift away from a unipolar order dominated by Washington and its allies. Tensions escalated sharply after South Africa adopted foreign policy positions that conflicted with US and European expectations. These include its neutral or critical stances on global conflicts, deepening cooperation with non-Western powers, and its continued participation in blocs that challenge Western dominance. For U.S. lawmakers, these choices represent more than diplomatic disagreements. They are perceived as strategic defiance. The United States remains one of South Africa's largest trading partners. Preferential access to U.S. markets through trade frameworks has historically benefited South African agriculture, automotive manufacturing, and industrial exports. Threats to withdraw or restrict these privileges carry significant economic weight. Yet South Africa appears increasingly willing to absorb economic pressure rather than surrender policy autonomy. At the heart of the dispute is South Africa's insistence on an independent foreign policy. Officials argue that alignment with Western positions should not be automatic and must reflect national interests, regional stability, and historical context. This philosophy directly challenges the expectation that economic partnerships require political obedience. U.S. lawmakers have framed South Africa's actions as undermining Western unity. Congressional hearings and policy statements increasingly reference punitive options, including trade penalties, tariff adjustments, and reviews of bilateral agreements. While no formal sanctions have been enacted, the rhetoric itself signals escalating pressure. South Africa's leadership has responded with defiance rather than retreat. Government officials emphasize that the country will not be bullied into abandoning its principles. They argue that foreign policy should not be dictated by access to markets, and that sovereignty cannot be traded for short-term economic comfort. This confrontation highlights a broader transformation in global geopolitics. Emerging economies are asserting greater autonomy as alternatives to Western markets expand. South Africa's trade ties with Asia, the Middle East, and other African nations reduce its reliance on any single partner. This diversification weakens the effectiveness of traditional Western pressure tactics. China's role in this shift is impossible to ignore. As South Africa's largest trading partner, China offers markets, investment, and financing without the political conditions often attached to Western partnerships. This reality emboldens Pretoria's foreign policy independence and complicates Washington's leverage. South Africa's membership in multilateral blocs further reinforces its strategic positioning. Participation in these groupings reflects a commitment to multipolarity and resistance to domination by any single power center. For U.S. policymakers, this represents a long-term challenge to Western influence in Africa's most industrialized economy. The economic stakes are substantial. U.S. trade penalties could disrupt key sectors, affect employment, and unsettle investors. However, South African officials calculate that long-term independence outweighs short-term losses. They argue that economic resilience depends on diversification, not dependence. Public opinion within South Africa largely supports the government's stance. Many citizens view Western pressure as a continuation of historical patterns of control. The narrative of resisting external interference resonates strongly given the country's colonial and apartheid past. U.S. officials counter that trade relationships are built on shared values and mutual expectations. They argue that South Africa benefits disproportionately from access to Western markets while undermining Western diplomatic objectives. This framing justifies punitive measures in the eyes of American lawmakers. Yet critics in Washington warn that aggressive penalties could backfire. Punishing South Africa risks pushing it further toward alternative alliances and accelerating the decline of Western influence in Africa. It also sends a message to other nations that independence carries costs, potentially fueling resentment rather than compliance. South Africa's economic strategy increasingly reflects preparation for such outcomes. Investments in regional trade, infrastructure, and local industrial capacity aim to reduce vulnerability to external shocks. The African Continental Free Trade Area provides new opportunities for intra-African commerce that bypass Western markets entirely. The confrontation also exposes fractures within the Western alliance. European nations, while critical of South Africa's positions, are more cautious about economic retaliation due to their own trade interests. This divergence complicates coordinated pressure and weakens its effectiveness. For Washington, the South Africa standoff is symbolic. It represents a test case for how the U.S. responds when a strategically important partner refuses alignment. The outcome will influence how other emerging powers calculate the risks of defying Western preferences. South Africa's leadership appears resolute. Statements from top officials emphasize dignity, independence, and long-term national interest. The message is consistent. Economic partnerships cannot come at the cost of political submission. As global power continues to fragment, confrontations like this are likely to multiply. The era when economic leverage guaranteed political compliance is fading. South Africa's defiance reflects a broader rebalancing in which sovereignty is increasingly valued over access. The standoff remains unresolved. Trade penalties remain a threat rather than a reality, but the trajectory is clear. South Africa is redefining its place in the world, and Washington is struggling to adapt to a partner that no longer accepts direction. What unfolds next will shape not only U.S. South Africa relations, but the future of Western influence across Africa. Whether pressure escalates or compromise emerges, one truth is undeniable: South Africa has drawn a line, and the global order is shifting around it.
You've been watching Echoes of Africa, where every story carries the sound of tomorrow. If this moved you, subscribe now, like, and share so Africa's voice never fades into silence.